The Ghostwriter's Confession. Liam's literary career was a masterpiece of failure. His one published novel had sold a number of copies best described as intimate. And his current occupation was writing soulless ad copy for a company that sold ergonomic office chairs. So when the letter arrived, embossed with the elegant spidery crest of the Blackwood estate, it felt like a message from another, more literary dimension. Julian Croft, the reclusive titan of modern fiction, wanted to hire him, not to collaborate, but to ghostwrite his memoirs. The offer was staggering, the opportunity career-defining. Liam packed his bags without a second thought, trading his cramped city apartment for the fog-shrouded cliffs and Gothic grandeur of Blackwood Manor. The manor was a character in itself, a sprawling stone edifice that seemed to grow organically from the rocky coastline, its windows like watchful eyes staring out at the turbulent sea. And at its center was Julian Croft himself. He was exactly as Liam had imagined, charismatic, imperious, with a brilliant mind and a voice that could hold you captive. He was a lion in winter, surrounded by the trophies of a celebrated life. And then there was his daughter, Isla. She was the manor's sharp, beautiful, and fiercely protective warden. She greeted Liam not with a handshake, but with a cool, assessing gaze that stripped him of his pretenses. She was the gatekeeper to her father's legacy, her wit a razor-wire fence around her emotions. From their first conversation, a sparring match over the merits of a Faulkner novel, Liam was utterly captivated. His work began in the manor's library, a cathedral of books and leather. He spent his days interviewing Julian, listening to his perfectly polished anecdotes, and his evenings sifting through boxes of old letters, journals, and photographs. It was a dream. The first discordant note appeared in a dusty, leather-bound journal from Julian's youth in post-war Paris. The public story, the one Julian had told in countless interviews, was that his breakout novel, The Crimson Moth, was a work of pure fiction, a tale of passion and murder among the city's bohemian elite. But the journal told a different story. It spoke of a real woman, a fiery artist named Sabine. It detailed a real, passionate, and volatile affair, and it described a real rival, a wealthy, brutish patron who was also in love with Sabine. The names were different, but the dynamics, the locations, the specific, granular details, they were all identical to the plot of The Crimson Moth. Liam's initial excitement at this literary discovery slowly curdled into unease. He reread the novel, this time with the journal as his key. The fictionalized murder in the book, the one that had been lauded for its chilling psychological realism, now felt less like an act of imagination and more like a confession. His relationship with Isla was the one true thing in this house of carefully constructed narratives. She would seek him out in the library, their verbal sparring softening into genuine conversations. He saw flashes of vulnerability beneath her sharp intellect, a deep loneliness that mirrored his own. He was falling for her, hard, and this growing affection made the secret he was unearthing feel like a betrayal. The final piece of the puzzle came not from a journal, but from a faded photograph he found tucked into an old book. It showed a young, smiling Julian in a Parisian cafe. With him was the beautiful, fiery Sabine, and at their table was another young man, his face half turned from the camera. Tucked into the man's lapel was a small, crimson moth pen. It was the brutish, unnamed rival from the journal. He felt the blood drain from his face. He recognized the man. He had seen his face in another photograph, in a memorial album Isla had shown him. It was Julian Croft's younger brother Alistair, who had, according to the official family history, died tragically in an accident in Paris at the age of 23. He stared at the photograph, the pieces falling into place with a horrifying, sickening click. The Crimson Moth wasn't just based on a true story. It was a confession, a beautifully written, critically acclaimed, and utterly brazen confession to the murder of his own brother. He looked up from the photo, his heart pounding. Isla was standing in the doorway of the library, watching him, a small, curious smile on her face. "Find something interesting, Mr. Byrne?" she asked. He looked at her, at the woman he was beginning to love, the daughter of the man he now suspected was a murderer. The entire legacy he had been hired to celebrate was a monument built on a secret grave, and he was now its sole, unwilling keeper.
Liam's world had been bifurcated. There was the sunlit, public world of Blackwood Manor, where he and Julian Croft discussed literary theory over glasses of expensive whiskey, and where he and Isla engaged in a deepening, charged flirtation during long walks along the cliff paths. Then there was the secret, subterranean world of his own mind, where every one of Julian's polished anecdotes was now filtered through the lens of suspected fratricide. He became an unwilling detective, his ghostwriting a cover for a quiet, desperate investigation. He reread Julian's journals, not as a biographer, but as a prosecutor, searching for cracks in the alibi, for inconsistencies. He found them everywhere. The timeline of his brother's accidental death was vague, the entries in the journal around that date uncharacteristically sparse and detached. His conversations with Julian became a delicate, dangerous dance. Liam would ask seemingly innocent questions about Paris, about his early influences, about his relationship with his brother, probing for a reaction, a flicker of guilt in the old man's intelligent, confident eyes. But Julian was a master of narrative. He controlled his own story with an iron will, his answers always smooth, practiced, and impenetrable. Alistair was a beautiful, tragic soul, full of passion but utterly lacking in direction. His death was a terrible waste. It was a performance, and Liam was the only one in the audience who knew it. His relationship with Isla was his only solace, and his greatest torment. The connection between them was growing stronger, more real with each passing day. One afternoon, while sheltering from a sudden storm in a small seaside cave, the tension that had been simmering between them finally broke. He kissed her. It was a kiss of salt and rain and a desperate shared loneliness. The moment was perfect, and it was built on a lie of omission that felt as vast and as deep as the sea raging outside. He was falling in love with the daughter of the man who had likely killed her uncle. The guilt was a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. He tried to learn more from her, but she was, in her own way, as fiercely protective of the family myth as her father. My father and Alistair were like fire and ice. Alistair was the wild one. Father was the anchor, always trying to save him from himself. His death, it broke my father. He never truly recovered. That's when he started writing The Crimson Moth. I think it was his way of processing the grief. She believed it. She believed in the story of the tragic, lost brother and the grieving, artistic genius. Liam listened, his heart aching, knowing that the truth would not just break her, it would shatter the very foundation of her identity. He knew he should leave. He should pack his bags, abandon the memoir, and disappear from their lives, taking the terrible secret with him. But he was trapped by his contract, by his writer's obsession with the truth, and most of all, by his feelings for Isla. The turning point came when Julian, pleased with Liam's progress, granted him access to his locked study, the inner sanctum where he had written all his masterpieces. "You'll find my original manuscripts in the bottom drawer of the desk," The raw material of the legend, my boy. He waited until the house was asleep before he let himself into the study. The room felt like a tomb, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 written lies. He found the manuscript for the Crimson Moth. It was written in a frantic, ink-blotched scrawl. The page is filled with crossed-out words and furious revisions. He wasn't looking for literary insight. He was looking for proof. He carefully examined the pages, searching for anything that hadn't made it into the final, published version. And then he found it. Tucked into the very back of the manuscript box, separate from the main text, was a single, folded page. It was a deleted epilogue, an alternate ending. In the published novel, the murderer, the charismatic protagonist, gets away with his crime, forever haunted but unpunished. But in this deleted scene, the character writes a final unsent letter, a confession, filled with a chilling philosophical justification for his crime. He writes that he did not just kill his rival, he absorbed his passion, his fire, his very essence, and that this act of violent consumption was what had finally transformed him from a mediocre artist into a great one. The final sentence of the confession made the hairs on Liam's arms stand on end. He wrote, "I did not destroy a life, I merely repurposed it for the sake of art." Liam stared at the page, his blood running cold. This wasn't a fictional character's confession. This was Julian Croft's artistic manifesto. It was the missing piece, the psychological motive, the confession of a man who believed his genius gave him the right to murder. He heard a soft footstep behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Isla was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "You're up late," she said, her voice quiet. "Looking for inspiration?" She walked into the room, her gaze falling on the page in his hand. "What's that?" He couldn't speak. He couldn't hide it. He just stood there, holding the proof that the father she adored was a monster, and the story of their family was the most elaborate and most terrible of all his fictions.
The silence in the study was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Isla's gaze was fixed on the single sheet of paper in Liam's trembling hand. He felt like a man holding a lit bomb, the fuse sizzling down to its inevitable, destructive end. "Let me see it," she said, her voice dangerously calm. It was not a request. He didn't have a choice. He handed her the deleted epilogue. She took it, her fingers brushing his, the brief contact sending a jolt through him. He watched her face as she read, the single lamp on the desk illuminating the play of emotions that crossed her features. Curiosity, confusion, and then a slow, dawning, gut-wrenching horror. She read the final damning sentence aloud, her voice a cracked whisper. "I did not destroy a life. I merely repurposed it for the sake of art." She looked up at him, her beautiful, intelligent eyes now wide with a terrible, unspoken question. She didn't need him to explain. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to read between the lines. She connected the confession in her hand to the photograph she had seen him with, to his strange questions, to the haunted look he'd had in his eyes for weeks. "Alistair," she breathed, the name of her long-dead uncle hanging in the air like a ghost. "This is about Alistair." Liam could only nod, his heart aching for her. She sank into her father's large leather armchair, the page still clutched in her hand. The protective, defiant armor she wore around herself had shattered, leaving behind a raw, shocking vulnerability. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, it was an accident. My father loved him." "Isla," Liam said gently, kneeling before her. "The journals, the photographs, the timeline of the accident, it all matches the narrative of the novel perfectly."
He watched as she processed it, her mind, as sharp and analytical as his own, piecing together the terrible truth. He saw the moment she finally accepted it. It was like watching a beautiful, intricate glass sculpture crack from the inside out. Her grief was not loud or hysterical. It was a deep, silent, implosive thing. "All my life," she said, her voice hollow, "I have been the curator of his legacy. I defended him. I protected him. I was the keeper of a beautiful, perfect lie. And you," she looked at Liam, and her eyes were filled not with anger at him, but with a profound, shared despair. "And you knew, and you stayed." "I stayed because of you," I confessed, the truth finally spilling out. "I should have left. I should have walked away, but I couldn't." They were no longer the writer and the client's daughter. They were just two people, trapped in the orbit of a monstrous secret, their own fragile connection now inextricably linked to it. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Heavy, deliberate footsteps were approaching the study. Julian Croft. Isla reacted with a speed and instinct that stunned Liam. She stood up, her grief instantly masked by a cold, hard composure. She folded the confession and tucked it into the pocket of her dressing gown. She smoothed her hair, her face becoming a placid, unreadable mask. She was a Croft, after all. She knew how to perform. The door opened and Julian stood there, a decanter of brandy in his hand. "Couldn't sleep," he announced, his charismatic smile firmly in place. "Thought I might find my two favorite night owls burning the midnight oil." His gaze swept the room, from Liam's pale face to his daughter's rigid posture. He was a master of reading people. He knew something was wrong. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice losing some of its warmth, an edge of suspicion creeping in. "Everything is fine, Father," Isla said, her voice impossibly steady. She walked over to him and kissed his cheek, a gesture that now seemed grotesque to Liam. "Liam was just showing me some of his brilliant work. He's truly capturing your voice." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, searching his daughter's face for the truth. For a tense, breathless moment, no one moved. Then, Isla did something that chilled Liam to the bone. She smiled, a bright, beautiful, and utterly false smile. "In fact," she said, turning her gaze on Liam, a strange, challenging light in her eyes, "I think it's time we moved on to the next chapter, the one about Paris. I'm sure Liam has so many questions he'd like to ask you about your time there, about Alistair." It was a declaration of war, delivered with a daughter's kiss. She had not exposed her father. She had trapped him. She was inviting Liam into her conspiracy, forcing him to become her accomplice in a slow, psychological dismantling of the man they had both, in their own ways, idolized. Liam looked from the daughter's cold, determined face to the father's suddenly wary one. He was no longer just the ghostwriter. He was a character in the final, terrible chapter of the Croft family saga. And he had no idea how it was going to end.
The days that followed Isla's declaration of war were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Blackwood Manor, once a place of literary pilgrimage for Liam, became a suffocating stage for a tense three-person play. The script was unwritten, the stakes impossibly high. Isla was the director. Her grief had metastasized into a cold, brilliant fury. She used her intimate knowledge of her father, his vanities, his insecurities, his intellectual pride, to orchestrate a subtle, relentless assault on his carefully constructed reality. She and Liam became a silent, efficient team, their conspiracy a dark, unspoken bond that drew them closer even as it isolated them from the rest of the world. Their new strategy was simple. They would use the memoir itself as a weapon. During his interviews with Julian, Liam,
guided by Isla's whispered suggestions, began to press on the inconsistencies of the Paris years. He was no longer the fawning acolyte, he was a meticulous, forensic biographer. "It's fascinating, Julian. In your journal, you mentioned Sabine's studio was on the Rue de Seine, but in an earlier letter, you place it on the Quai Voltaire. A minor detail, of course, but for the sake of historical accuracy." Julian would parry the questions with practiced ease, but Liam saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. He was a man used to controlling his own narrative, and for the first time, his ghostwriter was questioning the text. Isla's attacks were more personal, more cruel. She would bring Alistair into every conversation, her words laced with a sweet, poisonous nostalgia. "I was looking at old photographs today, Father. There are so few of Uncle Alistair. It's almost as if he was erased. We must make sure he has a prominent place in the memoir, to honor his memory." Liam watched as the constant, subtle pressure began to wear down Julian. The commanding author became irritable, his sleep disturbed. The lion was pacing in his cage, sensing a threat he couldn't quite identify. The bond between Liam and Isla deepened in the crucible of their shared secret. Their late-night strategy sessions in the library would often dissolve into moments of raw, unguarded intimacy. They found solace in each other's company, two co-conspirators in a just and terrible cause. He saw the immense pain beneath her anger, and she saw the man who was risking everything, not for a story, but for her. The breaking point came during a violent coastal storm that rattled the very foundations of the manor. They were in Julian's study, a fire roaring in the hearth. Liam had just finished a draft of the Paris chapter, a carefully worded, deliberately ambiguous account that hinted at the darker truth without stating it outright. He handed it to Julian to read. As Julian read, his composure finally began to crack. Liam had used his own words against him, weaving quotes from the deleted epilogue into the main narrative, framing them as Julian's philosophical musings on the nature of art and sacrifice. "What is this?" Julian's voice was a low growl. He looked from the pages to Liam, his eyes blazing with a cold fury. "This is not my voice. This is a perversion." "I was merely trying to capture the raw philosophical underpinnings of your work," Liam said calmly. "This is an accusation," Julian hissed, rising to his feet. At that moment, Isla, who had been watching from the corner of the room, stepped forward. She was holding the single folded page of the deleted epilogue. "Is it an accusation, Father, or is it a confession? Your words, not his." She laid the page on the desk between them. The mask of the literary giant, of the grieving brother, of the loving father, finally crumbled. Julian stared at the page, then at his daughter's unforgiving face, and finally at Liam, the ghost who had unearthed his sins. The look in his eyes was one of pure, venomous hatred. You worm, you dug through my life, my private thoughts." "He found the truth you buried," Isla cut him off, her voice like ice. Julian let out a wild, despairing roar of a laugh. "Truth? There is no truth. There is only the story, and I am the one who writes it." He lunged for the manuscript on his desk, his intention clear, to destroy the evidence, to burn the narrative that had escaped his control. But Liam was faster. He snatched the pages away just as Julian's hands closed on them.
The silence that followed the crash was more profound than any Liam had ever experienced. It was a silence of dust, of splintered wood, and of a story that had come to a sudden, violent end. He and Isla lay on the floor, tangled together, the air thick with the smell of old paper. The official story, the one crafted with the cold, precise logic of the manor's lawyers, was a tragic accident. The storm, the unstable, ancient bookshelf,
the frail old man. It was a neat, plausible narrative. The world mourned the loss of a literary giant, and the secrets of Blackwood Manor were buried with him. He stayed. He stayed through the funeral, a somber, theatrical affair that Julian himself would have admired. He stayed to help Isla sort through the wreckage of her father's life and legacy. They moved through the grand, silent rooms of the manor like ghosts, two survivors of a war no one else knew had been fought. The memoir was never finished. The manuscript, along with the single, damning page of the deleted epilogue, was locked away in a safe, a final, unread chapter. Their relationship, which had been forged in the heat of conspiracy and shared danger, now existed in a strange, quiet limbo. The mission that had united them was over, and they were left to navigate the complicated emotional debris. The love was still there, a deep, powerful undercurrent, but it was now intertwined with the shared trauma of what happened in the study. One evening, weeks after the funeral, they were standing on the cliff path, watching the sea churn below. The wind was cold, but they stood close together, sharing a fragile warmth. "What will you do now?" Liam asked quietly. Isla was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "For years, my life was about preserving a story that was already written, protecting it, curating it." She turned to look at him, her eyes clear and steady for the first time since that night. I think it's time I wrote my own." She told him she was going to sell the manor. She was going to use the money to create a foundation for young, struggling writers. A real legacy, built not on lies, but on a genuine love for the art that her father both mastered and perverted. "And you?" she asked, her gaze searching his. "Will you go back to writing about ergonomic office chairs?" A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I don't think so. I was a ghostwriter. I think I'm done with ghosts." He knew he couldn't stay. The manor, the cliffs, the very air he breathed here was haunted by Julian Croft, and his relationship with Isla, as real and as powerful as it was born of that haunting. To truly be together, they first needed to be apart, to find out who they were outside the shadow of her father's story. He left a week later, on a crisp, clear morning. She walked him to his car. There were no dramatic declarations, no tearful goodbyes. "If you ever write that novel," she began, "I'll send you the first copy," he finished for an in-joke, a quiet promise hanging in the air. He drove away, watching her in his rearview mirror until the imposing silhouette of Blackwood Manor swallowed her from view. 2 years passed. Liam moved to a small, quiet town and finally wrote his own novel. It wasn't a thriller. It wasn't a grand, sweeping epic. It was a quiet, character-driven story about forgiveness and about the difference between the stories we inherit and the ones we choose to write for ourselves. He sent the first copy, as promised, to the P.O. box address she had given him. A month later, a package arrived for him. Inside was a newly published book of short stories funded by the Croft Foundation for New Writers. The author was Isla Croft. Tucked inside the front cover was a note, written in a familiar, elegant hand. It said, "I thought this chapter was much better than the last one. Let's write the next one together." Below the words was a train ticket to a city he had never been to before. A new place, a blank page. Liam smiled, a real, unrestrained smile. The ghostwriter's confession was finally over. It was time for the unwritten epilogue to begin.